How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. Today, we're going to continue our discussion on PTSD. We had William Young on a few days ago. We also had Tony Scaglione on to share his story and also to inform us of some resources that we may not be aware of. And today, we're going to continue the discussion. We're going to share a personal story with Cody Cook. I know her from the LEO Roundtable. She's excellent. We had her on once before. We talked about, I believe it was how people may be forgotten when they're forced into retirement, especially for those that, really want to be in the profession of law enforcement and what we need to do to make sure that they don't feel forgotten. And what's cool about having this discussion, besides the fact that you are a survivor of PTSD, you also may be aware of some resources that my audience may not be aware of. So do you mind introducing yourself to our audience again?
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me again on Tier Talk, Anthony. My name is Cody Ann Cook. I'm a retired police officer from the upstate New York area. I've worked in a variety of agencies and in a variety of positions, doing federal prisoner transports, working in the courthouse, working road patrol. The majority of my career, I did undercover narcotics for 10 years off and on. I did some navigational patrol. So, I had the opportunity to work in a wide array of job spaces and see what all of those were about. I liked being on the road. I liked doing investigations and closing out my cases. That was kind of my forte. But I also enjoyed doing the undercover narcotics a lot.
Well, first off, thank you for coming on. Obviously, we appreciate you. And for the audience that sees that I'm bringing in also police as well, is because there's a lot of police officers that see us as equals, and they feel that if they're able to have access to resources, then we also should have that same accessibility. So I think it's great for those that have the knowledge to share that knowledge, especially on this platform where we feel sometimes we're forgotten. Now we'll come back from our sponsors, and then we'll discuss PTSD, share a personal story. Thank you for obviously being willing to do that. And then kind of maybe shoot into some resources that we may not know exist for our heroes who work in corrections. So guys, if you haven't, to show Tier Talks for you, brave men and women that work in corrections, so please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. That bell will notify you every time I post a video. I will go to our sponsor. We come back. Let's go into PTSD. Stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it. It's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
Guys, inmate manipulation is a course that is highly needed. It's the process that's so slow moving and subtle that you don't realize it's happening. When inmates choose to manipulate, they manipulate our need to react. Situational awareness and insight is going to save your career. It's going to save you from doing foolish things. Listen to your gut. So the more insight we have, the more we can recognize what isn't so overt, and we can correct our behavior before we fall into a trap that we can't get out of. If you allow an inmate to pull you out of your prescribed role, you are opening up a door for a host of problems. Inmate manipulation, the psychology behind inmate manipulation. Available now. Link in description. All right. Hey, Cody, real quick, this has been my third time covering this topic throughout the week, and I think it's definitely a very important topic because I saw that the first episode we did with William Young, and guys, if you have a chance, please check out that episode, was a very good dialogue. And basically, the one thing that we kind of forgot to touch on, or we were so involved in the dialogue that we really may not have brought up as many resources as we thought we could have. And then when you reached out and said, hey, Gange, I can help with this. I love the discussion you had. This is something I'm very passionate about. I can help with those resources. First off, thank you for willing to do that. Also for my audience. But I want to ask you, why is this topic so important to you?
This topic is important to me because It's very personal. It's something that I endured in my career and in my life. And it pushed me over the brink, I would say. I'd gotten to the point where I considered suicide. I was having a really difficult time in my personal relationships, in my professional relationships, and not understanding what was going on. You know, I couldn't figure out what my problem was. And thankfully I had some outreach and some resources and things that kind of grounded me. But in that journey, it made me realize that there really is a lack of education and resources for those of us who endure PTSD. And I want to preface this with saying that not only do I respect what your job is and what anybody in corrections does, I think you guys see the shit of the shit. You know, when we're out in the street, we have the happy days where we get to go bring a kid an ice cream cone and interact with families and community members. And there's some joy in our job. Yeah, we endure some really traumatic things and see some horrible things in our careers. On the other hand, what you guys do is day in and day out of not getting to see the joy of the world. You get to be in, excuse my language, the shit of the shit, and deal with people who have possibly lost hope or have such severe mental health issues. They don't care anymore. And I give you guys a ton of credit. I think what you're doing and you're immersing yourselves in is much more likely to cause PTSD than what we're doing. I'm not saying that police officers aren't prone to it. I'm just saying that what you guys are inundated with daily is very traumatic in the long term. So I think PTSD education for corrections, law enforcement, EMS, firefighters is quintessential to having successful careers and long timers who don't get burned out.
You know, I like how you mentioned that when we talk about the importance of PTSD in corrections, we're not minimizing the importance of PTSD in police work, PTSD in military. We had a discussion in our tier talk off the first video we did with William Young where somebody thought that we were minimizing in comparison the military with us. And the reason, it doesn't mean to come out that way. It's just that when you're in a profession that's forgotten, you get stuck into this, I have to compete to let people know that we exist. So just as you said, it's kind of not that we're minimizing, but we're reminding people, and yes, we're doing it aggressively because for however long we have not been seen in that equal light. So even if it means that we have to just take the light for a moment so people can see us, we're going to take the light because we have never had that light on this profession. So I appreciate how you were able to balance that by saying that, you know, it's what we go through is just as important as the other professions. So thank you for noticing that.
Absolutely. What people need to realize is it doesn't matter what your profession is as far as the mechanisms that arrive you at PTSD. We each have unique experiences with trauma and what it does to our brain and how it brings us to actually developing PTSD. What's not unique about PTSD is no matter how strong a person you are, no matter how much of a warrior mentality you have and how good you are at your job and how good your peer support is, at the end of the day, you're just a human being with emotions. That's how God made us. And the mechanisms of PTSD, whether you're in the military, law enforcement, firefighter, EMS, corrections, a nurse, a doctor, the end result is the same. PTSD is PTSD. However you got it, whatever the career and driving force was that brought you to it, in the end, what we have is the same, and how we get treated and how we learn coping mechanisms for it is varied amongst people and their personalities, but you know, the purpose of it is the same. I don't want to say everybody's the same. Everybody has a unique story, and I honor that and respect that, but you know, the treatment for it is the same, basically.
Right. And what I like about the shows that we do is I feel that the way people connect to other individuals is realizing that maybe we have a shared experience. Now, even though there may be some difference in the specifics of that experience, ultimately the outcome is a trauma that we're having trouble overcoming. And I believe that what's great about having someone like you on the show, someone like William Young or someone like Tony Scaglione, is because these are people that went through it. You're trying their best to deal with it every day. And I think that's what builds that instant connection between them and the person that may be afraid to say something, the person that may be afraid to admit some level of vulnerability. Now, I was wondering if you don't mind, thank you for doing this, if you can share your personal story and then what obviously led you to the route you're on where you realized that, you know what, you could be a resource here. Okay. And what was it that really motivated you to take on this incredible mission?
Absolutely. So I grew up in a household with, for the young part of my life until I was about 6, with an extremely abusive biological father. Um, Eventually, my mom and my biological father split and went their separate ways. And then she married my stepfather, who to me is my dad and is a very wonderful man. Thankfully, I had that experience in the latter part of my young childhood. But that developed, certain mechanisms in my brain about trauma and abuse. And then you fast forward into my late teens, early 20s, in the early 1990s. I was raped by a police officer, and I never told anybody because I wanted to become a police officer. So I kept that secret for over 20 years. And that was a really difficult thing for me because it started to break down the trust in a realm of society where there's supposed to be ultimate trust and ultimate integrity. And that's right at the beginning of me starting my track in my career. In 1994, I went to the police academy and started on my journey as a police officer. I wanted to be a police officer since I was 3 years old. I had an experience when I was a young child that made me want to become a police officer, which was a great one. And I was very proud to become a police officer. And it was kind of a turning point in my life where I found my self-esteem and my sense of direction. So let's fast forward into the track that most of us endure in our career, is that you start to have experiences on the job where you see things that are traumatic. You can see people with their heads split open, people die in car accidents, delivering the message that somebody's child is dead, doing CPR on somebody and not having them make it. A variety of traumatic situations, none of which on their own would develop PTSD. But in 2004, 2005 area of time, I started to have difficulties with a supervisor. So difficult, in fact, that it turned into a stalking and harassment situation. I wasn't given a bulletproof vest. My payroll was messed up. My longevity time was taken away as a punishment. The list went on and on and on of things that were happening to me. And eventually that police chief was harassing me to the point where he actually physically assaulted me, not in a sexual manner, but in an actual physical assault where he choked me over backwards in a chair in our office. And I finally got to, kind of a breaking point. He would yell at me every day at work. I started finding that before I'd go to work, I would get really shaky. I would get sick to my stomach and nauseated. So at the time he did the physical assault, I called my family. I had stayed up all night after I'd gotten home from my shift and had that experience. I called my family, and my family had noticed that I had begun to distance myself. I'd become less social, less giggly, less friendly, more easier to, become irritable. I lived approximately an hour from my family. I stopped going home for holidays over the course of a few years, to the point where it culminated where this assault happened. And my father basically said to me, you can be the strong young woman that we raised and stick up for yourself, or you can be somebody's puppet and let them kick you around for the rest of your life. Like, you have a decision to make. So at that time, I went to my union. I filed a formal complaint. That police chief eventually was forced to resign and still continued to harass me for the next 2 years after that. In addition to the new incoming, there was a police officer who became the new chief who wasn't the kindest person either. So I had a variety of things going on. Stuff kept coming down the pike. Then I had some very traumatic stuff with some family members. So I had what you call cumulative PTSD. Now, let me flash forward to about 2007, 2008 mark. I went to the New York State Police and filed a formal complaint because my own police department, mayor, and village was not doing anything any longer in regards to what was happening, which was continued abuse. I filed this complaint, and that sergeant at the state police hooked me up with their IAP person, a man named Bernie Feldman, who called me up, and we had this big, long discussion. And at the end of the discussion, he goes, Cody, you really need to get some help. You have PTSD. It's very obvious from the questions I've asked you. You need some clinical help. And my reply was, who the fuck do you think you are? Like, I can do it. I'm strong. I'm fine. Fuck you. And I hung up on him. That was the beginning of my journey with actually identifying with the fact that I had PTSD, although I was in denial at first. So let's flash forward to years later. I was going to college, finishing up my bachelor's in psychology. And where I went to school was Wells College in upstate New York, which is a private college. And they have a very intense bachelor's program that requires a master's level thesis. So I was doing my thesis on PTSD, and Tony Scaglione, your guest you had on last night, I wanted to do an internship with something with law enforcement with PTSD. I called up Tony, knowing what his journey was. We had a big, long discussion. He's like, man, Cody, you got it bad. You're going through a really hard time. I want to refer you to an in-house treatment program for first responders with PTSD called OnSite Academy, which is in Westminster, Massachusetts. I ended up going there, and from there, I completed my thesis and actually became a certified International Critical Incident Stress Foundation instructor. So it was my journey through dealing with PTSD that led me to become passionate about helping others. And what I've realized is that PTSD is a permanent brain injury. You know, it's not something you can just get over. You know, a lot of people don't really believe it's a problem. It really truly is a mechanism that alters the way your body chemistry and your brain chemistry works. And there's specific reasons why that happens. And when you get to that point, it doesn't mean you can't go back to being a functioning, happy, healthy person. It's just you have to learn to cope and deal with the PTSD through proper treatment and learn coping mechanisms to help you for your journey the rest of your life.
Well, I'm going to tell you something. That's definitely a very powerful story. I want to ask, because I think the first strength that I noticed that you had is that when you were raped by a police officer, how were you able to separate the profession from the individual?
It was very difficult. There was time actually when Officer Scaglione was involved with his experience that gave him his main experience that gave him PTSD, which was an officer-involved shooting of a woman who had killed his partner, Mike Padula. Mike was a friend of mine, and I'd gone to the funeral, and the officer who raped me was there. There was time periods where professionally I'd have to interact with this individual. It was very difficult. I would see him. Even talking about it right now makes my heart race. It was hard, you know, it was difficult, but you just got to keep going. I mean, that person wins if they crush your spirit. And I have a saying I came up with, and it's kind of my motto for life. And that is, don't ever let anybody else's words or actions take the wind out of your sails. And that is something I fundamentally believe from my core, is that no matter what you endure in life, even if you arrive at PTSD from the trauma and the things you've endured, that doesn't mean you can't be happy and you can't be successful in your life. And that is your choice. You know, it's your choice to keep living and keep thriving.
You know, we both share something in common. We both have bachelors in psychology. So one of the things I was, when I was listening to your story, was a lot of people they think it's easier to generalize the animosity, instead of me focusing on the one, it's easier to generalize it and define a whole profession. I mean, I actually, when I teach inmates versus officers, I tell guys it's not an us versus them. When you have a problem, you have to try to do what you can to make sure that you specify what that problem is and don't generalize that problem out. But it takes a lot of courage to do that, a lot of insight. So, I mean, for you to be able to go through that one, hold on, my phone's right here, that one negative experience, and to be able to really focus your concern on where that concern needs to be, that says a lot, especially not just you, but also in the road to recovery.
Absolutely. Right? And actually, my journey with dealing with that secret that I carried for so long came out when I decided to go to OnSite Academy. You have to go through what's called an intake. And that's where you're disclosing traumas, and you don't want to hide what those are, because if you don't talk about them and you don't get them out and place them, they stay in what's called the amygdala of your brain, which is in deep in the hindbrain, and has to do with adrenalized reactions and trauma. And so if you don't move it up to the forefront of your brain or the hippocampus of your brain and discuss it, when you go through the treatment program, there's going to be some trauma that's lingering back here while you're addressing the main ones you wanted to talk about. And in the end, you don't solve anything. You really have to be honest with yourself and honest with intake about what the totality is of what gave you all these traumas. And so at that point, I actually disclosed to Officer Scaglione, to Tony Scaglione, that I had been raped by this person that he had worked with. And in disclosing that, I had found out that there was another woman that he had raped within the year I had been raped, within a year's time, who looked similar to me, and actually had him arrested, eventually dropped the charges, moved away, and has never come back to the area and refuses to talk to anybody. We actually, through my attorney, attempted to contact her. because I had filed a federal lawsuit against my former employer, and I was dealing with a bunch of facts that were coming into that lawsuit. And so I had attempted to reach out to her, but I kind of had, it's almost like a survivor guilt where I had felt, oh my God, I kept my mouth shut for 20 years. And had I come out and had him arrested in the first place, maybe that wouldn't have happened to somebody else. So that was another thing that was like, it was gut wrenching for me to find that out. But that all came out, and discussing that and disclosing my trauma was ultimately because Officer Scaglione helped me and got me into OnSite. And that's one of the reasons I became an educator, is I want to help somebody else. I don't care what your field of profession of first responder, professional public servant. If somebody needs to talk, they can always contact me through LinkedIn. I will share a dialogue with them, possibly, or through Facebook Messenger, whatever. They can reach out to me, and then we can figure out a way to talk privately that is not documented in writing. So thankfully I had somebody to help me.
Well, Tony seems to be a very empathetic person. I think Tony may have seen a lot of similarities from him to you. Like, basically, he may have seen something that, he battled in you. And I wanted to ask, you, in order for someone to really understand what's going on with them, they really have to look back. I mean, it's not so much about the moment at hand, but rather, like you said, accumulative, what's leading to that moment. And then finally, I just explode. So how hard is that for someone to look back and try to identify what the actual cause is? Like, I may be yelling at my wife now, but is it really my wife that's the problem?
Okay, so let's talk about a couple things here. I'll try not to make this too in-depth so people can follow it. But first of all, a lot of people who have cumulative trauma have something called a kickback memory. A kickback memory is if a certain behavior happened today or a certain trauma happened today, what is it reminiscent of in your life? Like, let's say I responded to a car accident and I see something, but when I was a little girl, I saw a similar car accident where somebody died in the same capacity. My kickback memory would be that car accident when I was a little girl that traumatized me, not necessarily the car accident I see today. A lot of times people with PTSD have some kind of kickback memory, whether it's a reminiscent of somebody's behavior, a trauma, they saw something, an incident. There is cumulative trauma PTSD, and there's immediate PTSD. Immediate would be something, I'll just use this as an example, say September 11th, 9/11. That was so dramatic. The people that were involved with that, witnessed that. They're so vulnerable. That obviously could stimulate PTSD. Something as simple as a car accident can stimulate PTSD in some people. So in answer to your question, going back and deciphering where your feelings originated has to be done with a professional. That's not something I want people sitting down on their own couch and going, because thinking about the trauma can start to draw it up. And if you don't have the coping mechanisms yet, and you do that, you're making yourself very vulnerable. It can even lead to suicidal ideations. So I implore people to do it with a professional. Now, what you're talking about, like, I'm going to tell a little story, a little example. I'm going to do it from the law enforcement perspective because that's the easiest way for me to explain. Let's say I go to a bar fight and somebody goes to attempt to break a bottle over my head. I'm the only responding law enforcement there. I'm waiting, hoping backup, my brothers and sisters arrive, the troops arrive and help me. In the meantime, I have somebody who's going to break a bottle over my head. So technically they want to kill me. Finally, we get everything under control. Their officers show up. We get them arrested, processed through the PD. And the next call comes in. In my agency, our police department had to respond to all fire calls. It comes in for a house fire with 5 people trapped in the house fire. So you go lights and siren blasting to this house fire like, oh my God, there's people in there. We're going to have to get them out. Your adrenaline's dumping, of course. And you get there and it turns out it was a little kid who called 911 and couldn't convey properly what was going on. And all it was a toaster with burning toast, right? There's no entrapment. There's no house fires, just burning toast. But you responded with your adrenaline going to this call thinking there's going to be 5 people possibly burning to death in this house. Anytime your adrenaline dumps, you use all 5 of your senses: sight, hearing, taste, smell, touch. So let's fast forward a year from this date you go to the burning toast. Your wife or husband makes you breakfast in bed. It's your anniversary. They're trying to do something sweet. They come and kind of blast open the door, startle you out of your sleep, which you don't get much of if you're doing our jobs. It's broken. And the door opens, and the first smell that hits your nose is burning toast, because they burned the first batch of toast they made, but they remade you good toast, right? So they come over with their tray, and they're all happy, and they're like, here's your breakfast in bed. And you're like, whoa, what the, and you're angry. Your first response is anger. And they're like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, happy anniversary to you too, jerk. I'm just making you breakfast in bed. What happened is, as I spoke of before, there's a amygdala in your hindbrain. Anytime your adrenaline dumps and you get that fight or flight syndrome and you use your 5 senses, you produce a memory bank of those of that experience. That came from the beginning of time, from the caveman, and that's a life-saving mechanism where your brain and your body has taught your brain chemistry to store those memories so that if it happens again, you're already on go mode to save your own ass, right? So now you're just smelling burnt toast, but your brain just told you there's 5 people burning to death in a house and you need to respond. That's where that instant knee-jerk adrenaline dumping reaction comes up. And when you get serious PTSD, which I had, you will find that you have a startle response that's like nothing else. I mean, I could watch myself drop my keys on the counter because I came home and, and the keys would hit the counter and I would actually jump. That startle response becomes so entrenched in your daily living behavior that then it starts to affect your moods. So your moods and your response in fight or flight are what? Anger and fear. And anger always masks fear, right? That's a life-saving part of the human body. So that's where the response comes, where you're talking about, where you get angry at your wife, you get impatient, you can't deal with your child asking you a question. There's a lot of things that are coming into play, and it's because your brain doesn't have the coping mechanisms to put things in the right place and deal with all the trauma that you have. It's like it's on overload.
That's why I think it's very important, like for CISM teams, the critical incident stress management teams, to be there soon after to give the person a chance to debrief. And it may not be to say, okay, after we debrief, you're going to be okay. But it's more of like saying, okay, we may have a problem here. And, it's time that we find a way to address how you're coping with it. Because I'm sure, I think right at that initial meeting with the CISM team, they're trained peer-to-peer counseling that should be able to notice that this may not be as evident now, but the way you're coping with it is not something that we feel is going to be able to help you in the long run. So obviously you're a big believer in debriefing after an incident, right?
Debriefing, when it happens properly, needs to happen at least 24 hours after the incident. And here's why. If you ask one of your officers about an incident that happened in the jail, and you ask them immediately after, and his adrenaline, and he's like, well, the guy did, and he's like getting it out, and he's angry, and he's upset, and he's like, and he's on go mode, right? So his brain is still processing things. If you ask him 24 hours later, he's going to be like, yeah, well, I got to cell block C, and then this guy did blah, blah, blah. And he starts to have details that come forth. When your adrenaline's dumping and processing, you cannot recall those details. Often officers are asked after a shooting, or even corrections officer after a major incident, immediately to start writing down and documenting what happens. And then you ask them 24 hours later what happened, and their story changes. And now you look at them and think that they're dishonest. It isn't about honesty. It's about the way that the brain processes information. And in order to properly process information, you have to sleep. And a proper CISM team knows that and should give people 24 hours to process stuff. And when they do their debriefing, should talk about coping skills. And there's a few things that come to mind that I want to address really quickly. Is when we're really stressed out in our profession, there's a few things that many of them do. Smoke, drink coffee, or drink alcohol. All 3 of them affect your dopamine levels and stop you from sleeping properly. If you have to get into a REM sleep to process your memories. And in order to move stuff from the amygdala, that fight or flight thing we just talked about, into the hippocampus, which is like your filing box of memories in your brain, you have to sleep. So when you're stressed out and you've gone through a traumatic incident, most people don't sleep. They stay up, they talk to their friends, they get on the computer, they do social media, they bombard themselves with stuff because their adrenaline's going and their body can't shut down. So the CISM team is absolutely instrumental in helping preventing PTSD, because A, it can teach you coping mechanisms, and B, it gives you a family to belong to. You know, we all want to be part of something. We're group animals by nature, even though we don't always like to admit it. When you start to separate yourself from people and you start to alienate and shut down and become a loner, that's a big alarm bell. So that SISM team that goes in and does that debriefing needs to educate people on that, and not just the person enduring the situation, but also their family members. You know, when I do a SISM team meeting, so does Tony Scaglione, we have handouts that we give people to take home and give their spouse and their family members to understand what the process is of what they're going through and what some of the things are to look at that are warning bells.
Well, I think the key also is about the support that's provided too. I mean, letting the person know it's okay for you to feel this way, especially amongst an environment where, you know, you think or you assume that it's not. And most of the time it really is just an assumption. Most of the time people would be willing to say, hey, I feel something weird about this, and that will motivate other people to say the same thing. Like that assumption that we make that we have to have this brick wall that can't be broken. Most of us are waiting for someone to step up and show that their wall's broken. And then you'll find that there's other people saying, hey, I feel the same way too. And I will tell you, I believe now more than ever, especially in corrections, there are more people coming out if they know that there's going to be that support right afterwards. Like that SISM team, I think, opened up the door for letting the front line know we care and we know it's a concern. So now when the department sees that as a concern, then you're going to have people that are willing to step up and say, yes, it has been affecting me. Yes, it has been bothering me. And now that pioneer starts bringing in other people. It's like, wow, this is a deep issue. But again, it requires people to dig. And I know exactly with what you had to do. I'm sure that there are many people there where they won't admit it, but through your training, you know something's not right. They're not telling me something, and then it furthers the dialogue. But you also have to be careful that you don't get too aggressive, because they may be to the point where it's not that they don't want to admit it, but it's like they're defending the fact that it's not bothering them when it really is.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I mean, SISM and crisis management is all about giving people an avenue to know that they are okay and what they feel is okay. And what they're going through is a traumatic thing. It's an unusual situation that you're expected to process and behave in a normal way. And sometimes that's just not possible. So having that SISM meeting is a great way, that debriefing is a great way to give somebody an avenue to open up. And you know, we had a SISM team here locally that would respond for all kinds of calls. And often what we would do is we had one team that was comprised of every profession, corrections, fire, you know, EMS and law enforcement. So that if we responded to do something with a team, we would make sure that one of the people of the responders of the team was where we were going. So if we were going to the fire department, there was a firefighter on the team. If we were going to the EMS, there was an EMS person on the team, because they could correlate and identify with exactly what that person goes through. And always at any group SISM meeting we would have, there would be at least one or two people that would sit in the room. They'd have their arms crossed, you know, and they'd be like, oh, this is bullshit. I don't want to be here, right? When you start the meeting. And by the end, they're the person crying, going, oh my God, this is so awesome. This is like the best thing. And you guys really helped me. Because all of a sudden you open the door and the avenue for the floodgates to open, and for them to identify and feel like there's nothing wrong with them. There's not something wrong with you when you're stressed out. There's not something wrong with you when you're having repetitive dreams about a situation. There's not something wrong with you when you can't get it out of your head in broad daylight, when you're off doing something fun with your family and all of a sudden you're thinking about something at work. You're a normal person dealing with abnormal things. And so those crisis management meetings and debriefings, like you said, are absolutely essential at connecting people, connecting the dots and making them feel like they're in a safe place and it's okay to feel what they're feeling. You're muted again.
I was actually part of the SISM team as well. I did it for my department. And I found at first, if we came in and we sat there and we waited for people to come to us, it would never happen. And we kind of just, yeah, we're here, guys. And we made everybody know that we're here. But to sit there and wait for people to come was just, it wasn't happening. So what we decided to do was, you know, walk around under the guise that we're introducing ourselves. You know, let's meet the players. Let's see, you know, who works in this profession, you know, and just kind of let people know that, you know, we're there for them. But again, it wasn't an aggressive approach. It was more like, hey, we're here. This is what we're about. And I remember there was an incident where, and it made public record, so I could share it, where there was an instructor that was very close to the recruits. He was one of the best instructors we had, but he wound up having a domestic concern with his, I believe it's his girlfriend or his wife. I forget the specifics, but there was a murder involved and then a suicide. So a lot of people were conflicted in how they needed to feel about this individual because, one, he was a great guy and they loved him, but then there was the final act or the act before the final act that had some conflict for them. So as we were walking around, in our mind, in the group's mind, we knew that this was something that wasn't easy for people just to resolve, especially those that were new to the profession who just had him as an instructor, and all of a sudden, a couple of weeks later, reality hit. Yeah, the statistics we told you about suicide and stuff like that, that's real, guys. That's not just numbers. So they kind of got into something immediate. And I remember talking to one female, and we had the team. And as we were chatting, you know, I have no concerns, I'm good, and okay. And then as we go to leave, she's like, but I'm really curious, what is this team about? So it was just that simple question that turned us around. I told the other team, hey, why don't you guys go, you know, do what you got to do. And I chatted with her, and it went from what the team's about to her, to how she's dealing with this and how it's actually having an impact on how she views what we do. And it was just something that wasn't an outright cry for help. So there definitely has to be some expertise in kind of recognizing, you know, what is it that she's saying? What's the meaning behind it? Because if you take something at surface level, you know, most people without that training are like, oh no, she has no concerns. Why? Because, you know, she didn't outright say she had the concerns. Yeah, but you're meant to interpret that a little bit, you know, and I'm sure that you've had a lot of people in your dealings that will outright tell you that they don't have a problem, but there's a leak somewhere, and you're able to identify the leak and then go ahead and address the concern as best you can.
Absolutely. Well, you know, the way it was mandated here is that, say, a fire department had a big call, or a police department had a major call, something with trauma. It would be the chief or the lieutenant or the captain or whoever it was would order the debriefing, and everybody who had gone to that scene or been involved in that call was mandated to be in the debriefing. That doesn't mean they have to talk, doesn't mean they have to participate in any way, but they have to be there and be present. A lot of the times, you know, people that are opposed to it, one of the things that you see is you run it and you have the group talking, that person ultimately ends up opening up. And you're right, you do have to look for those cues. And that's why having the training to be part of a CISM team is really important, that each member knows to look for those cues. One of the cues we'd often see is that somebody gets up and walks out. And we'd have at our crisis teams what we call a runner. That's one of the persons on the team that would follow somebody when they leave. They're not allowed to just leave and go off on their own. They have to get cleared by that runner to make sure that they're stable and they're okay, because you might have just triggered something in that person by what you're talking about or what the team, you know, somebody in the group is talking about. And sometimes that's your cue, is just seeing that the person might, well, I'm out of here, you know, and they get up and leave and act like everything's fine. And then when they get outside, they crumble. Or when they get home, they're going to crumble. So the runner needs to make sure that that person is okay. You know, proper crisis response teams and debriefing teams really should consider taking the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation's certified instructor or training courses. They're a 2-day course. They're absolutely, you know, amazingly informative. And they were started by the founders of the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation, George Everly and Jeffrey Mitchell, who are both PhDs. They write a lot of books, which you can get the books. I don't know if you guys can see this okay. This one is called Integrative Crisis Intervention and Disaster Mental Health. They are just incredible you know, men that have done a lot of research and continue to do research to help all of us that are in this profession, both, you know, corrections, law enforcement, first responders, and their classes are instrumental in why I became an instructor for them. So
you mentioned the first resource, which is CISM, which is really on the departmental level, you know, basically making sure that you're taking care of your people. And sometimes I think I mentioned this with William too, is that the CISM team may not always it's not about having it requested to come out. It's about knowing when it's needed. Yes, don't get me wrong. We're going to answer the request, of course. I'm not saying that. But the department should know that, hey, this just happened. Let's just have that fail safe. Let's just send people over there. Because, again, in this profession, people aren't going to be so willing to cry for help. Not at this point. I think we're learning a lot. I think if we start to build trust with those CISM teams, then what we'll do is we'll start requesting them a lot more. But it's still that initial trust level. Who's actually on this team and who can I actually speak to? So I think a lot of the onus right now is having that CISM team by the department, but also for the department recognizing that, hey, this just happened. Let's just automatically make this mandatory. If this happens, this happens. If this happens, we send this team out.
I absolutely think it should be part of SOPs. That way there is no question. If it's in the SOPs that you have crisis management and debriefing teams and a CISM team respond because XYZ happened, great. It's already on the books that it's going to happen. And you should have crisis team members that come from other facilities or even a PhD who comes in with you or a mental health counselor. Because sometimes, as we all know, working in a department, there can be somebody we consider a brown noser or we don't trust. There has to be ultimate trust and confidentiality in those meetings. If that's breached, you dissolve the whole purpose of the team and it is not going to work. So it's imperative that the people who are on those teams have the integrity to maintain confidentiality and know proper response to help the members of their facility get through whatever trauma they've endured. And it can be simple little things. You can have one thing, like I talked about the cumulative trauma. You can have one of your corrections officer respond to one little thing, and that's the straw that broke the camel's back. To everybody else, it might seem insignificant, but to that person, it can be the final thing. By educating people about what PTSD is and how you get there and what some of the mechanisms of it are, what the behavioral changes are, that person might, unlike many other officers of past days, might go, man, I think I need some help, instead of going home and eating a gun or taking drugs or driving the car off a cliff or whatever it is they choose to do to kill themselves. When you have no education and no basis to figure out what's going on within yourself, that's a very volatile and vulnerable place to be. And if CISM is working properly, SOPs are proper, and people are being educated about PTSD, that's where we save lives.
Right. And I think also the other side of that is it shows an agency that cares, that we're not waiting for you to request it. The next day you come in, there they are. And if you want it, it's there. And I also, again, it's no different than when I was doing it. I said, you know what, we got to walk around. We can't just stay here and wait for people to come to us. I think at a higher level, same thing. We can't wait for the request to come. We have to know that this requires this. A riot just happened. Get that team there. An officer just died. Get that team there. We don't have to wait for the union to request it. And sometimes even if, let's say the union officers do request it, it would be great to say, oh, they're already scheduled to be there tomorrow.
Right.
Just to show you from the management level, we knew that was going to affect you. And we already have the team in play. They're en route. And the people that have to be involved in this team have to know that their availability during these times, like it's not a work schedule. You may have to come in on a day you're not scheduled to work. You may have to commit to 16 hours of making sure all shifts are covered. And let's not forget the overnight shifts. I mean, a lot of times when we have these teams come in, they usually kind of stay focused on the business hours, where that's not the case. You should literally be present for all three of those shifts, in case in my world, or in some shape, maybe there's sometimes two. But what I'm trying to say is that, people want to do it within the availability of the team members. No, the team members need to do it within the availability of the people who need it. Have a presence there, because it kind of makes like that other shift forgotten, where it's like, okay, so everybody else gets to have that on site with CISM, but if we need it, we have to call and make this request, and that may be somewhat unfair. I mean, I'm sure, have you ever dealt with that where you feel like not all shifts are properly covered?
I think when it initially started, yes, but when we got to the point over the last couple of years with the training, not so much anymore, because all any shift commander has to do is reach out to our 911 center and say, I need to activate the team. And the team calls, the 911 would activate the team would call that shift commander, and then we'd make arrangements of when to do the debriefing or the crisis management. So I think that you're right. Everybody has to have equal access. And that's part of feeling not like you're not alienated and alone. That's exactly what you're talking about when you introduced today's show, saying, you know, we need to put a light out there why we have the chance and give everybody out here a voice, especially in your profession. So I think that's great. And I think having a list of resources for teams also is a good thing to be able to give people. Let's say you work with a corrections officer who saw another corrections officer get shanked and killed, and is really kind of having a difficult time. And you're like, you know what? I really think you need to speak to an outside resource. Let's get you into some, you know, use the EAP and get you into some counseling. Goes to a counselor. You can interview your counselor and make sure you like your counselor before you go. You don't have to just go to any random counselor. You want to go to somebody who understands. Maybe they were a first responder initially themselves and then became a counselor, and knows mechanisms to deal with PTSD. You want to go to the right person. Let's say the guy comes back and says to you, I really, really like that counselor. It made a big difference to help me. Find out who that counselor is. Document it, because there's plenty of counselors out there that have good intentions and don't jack shit about our careers. I don't care how much they want to help us. If they haven't done it, they haven't been here, they may not understand. They may try, but it's not the same as somebody who's done it. So, you know about books, resources, counselors, people that help. And so that you have that list at hand, ready to grab and hand it over to somebody as they need it.
Well, you know, we put some of the resources, we said, okay, the system thing, that's departmental, right? But obviously that's what the department will decide to do. But I still think that we also have to take advantage of what we need ourselves, do our research. Tony Scaglione was quick to say these are the things that he did on his own, you know, because again, he wasn't so dependent on the department because he knew that the department could help, don't get me wrong, but he also has to find a way to help himself. So he educated himself and then found resources that really fit his need. And I was wondering if you can help me with that.
Absolutely. So Tony and I both attended a place called OnSite Academy, which is in Westminster, Massachusetts. And it's a treatment program. It's an in-house 1-week treatment program, or longer if needed be, which is specifically for first responders, including corrections, law enforcement, EMS, firefighters. There are no civilians there. Everybody who works there is your peer. Everybody who goes there is your peer. It's, you know, a great, great place, a life-saving place for me. Some people, you know, don't get to the point where they're going to go away and go to a treatment program. They're trying to identify what's going on with themselves. I have a book that I recommend by an officer named Jimmy Bremner. Jimmy was on a response team, you know, did SWAT. Jimmy Bremner is out of Canada. This is a fabulous book, especially, and I don't, you know, girls don't get mad at me for saying this, but this is a great book for men, because it's harder for men to identify and deal with where they are emotionally when it comes to trauma. Now, women are more biologically, we're more natural at exposing ourselves emotionally. This is an excellent book. So Jimmy Bremner, which is Bremner, boy, Robert, Edward, Michael, Nora, Edward, Robert. He's awesome. I really suggest this book. It's intense. If you are dealing with trust issues, which a lot of us who have PTSD stop trusting, even our spouses, our family, and the world around us, that's a big mechanism of PTSD. I recommend this book called Trust After Trauma. Matsakis is the last name. Please pardon me if I completely butchered saying this. It's Matsakis. Aphrodite Matsakis. I'm not sure if I said it properly, but that's the book. Really good book for family members, but also for yourself. And it has some little workbooks in it. It's great. She also has Loving Someone with PTSD, same author, for family members so that they learn and understand how to help you cope with your PTSD. And then lastly, I have a book that I really recommend for practitioners who want to help people that are dealing with PTSD and addiction. This is not for the lame person. This is not for, you know, corrections officers or civilians or people who are not professionals to go get and do on their own. This needs to be done by a licensed practitioner, whether they're a mental health counselor or a psychologist or a psychiatrist. It's called Seeking Safety. This is a workbook by Lisa Najavitz out of Boston University. She does a bunch of work up in Boston and a bunch of research. This is a fabulous book to help people deal with addictions and PTSD. Addictions range and are very prominent with people with PTSD, whether it's gambling, sex addiction, alcoholism, drug abuse. That's a common mechanism of PTSD. And so sometimes you're dealing with not only the aspect of having your PTSD, but you also have to deal with your addiction in order to cope with your PTSD. So you're dealing with two mechanisms at the same time. And this is the book for practitioners. In my opinion, it should be done in all group settings in prisons by any prison personnel that are dealing with mental health stuff. I think it would be fabulous for corrections to have this implemented as their, basically their Bible of how to deal with people dealing, populations dealing with PTSD, addiction, and trauma.
Right. First off, I wrote down every one of those books. I'm sure they're all available on Amazon. If people are watching the show right now, I wouldn't wait for the department to pick up those books and make them required reading. I would go ahead, and if you feel you need it, pick up one of those books. Tony also mentioned some books in the show we did yesterday. Again, they may be books that you may find to be good reads for the concerns that you have. But again, specifically what book you feel will hit you the most. So again, you may have to try a few books, but each book you can take something from. And also, it's the second time we mentioned the OnSite Academy. Are we able to break down a little bit about the OnSite Academy, what it offers, and what you were able to take from it? Because you interned there, correctly?
I interned at a place called Alpha House, which is an in-house lockdown addiction treatment facility. And I actually implemented Seeking Safety there on a trial during my internship, and they ended up adopting it as their standard one of their treatment classes of many there, but it is utilized still to this day at Alpha House. I went to OnSite Academy completely as a patient, in-house patient, to deal with my PTSD. OnSite Academy is run by a man named Hayden Dugan, who's a PhD, along with his wife, and they have a variety of counselors and programs there. And it's a learning center. You're going there, you deal and cope with your trauma and your stress. You learn coping mechanisms. You're taught how your body and your brain has responded to what you've endured. And it's absolutely amazing. I mean, I can't disclose too much about there because there's a extremely high level of confidentiality, but you can look up OnSite Academy online and learn more about the programs through their online program. And I can't recommend it enough. I mean, it's amazing, and it saved my life.
Well, this is great because I've never actually heard of the OnSite Academy. So the last 2 days I was able to hear more about it. So now if the audience that really is particular to this topic, this is the second time. So it's definitely for them to be like, you know what, let me look into this. I think once you hear it the second time, it's going to motivate them to check out the website. Do you have anything you'd like to say in closing to our audience?
I'd like to say in closing that I left law enforcement in 2008 when I filed my federal lawsuit against my former employer. That ultimately ended up getting thrown out by the Second Circuit of Appeals because I didn't file in a timely manner, although all the charges were found to be founded. I lost my suit. I dealt with a variety of health issues in addition to my PTSD. And after dealing with all those and deciding I really missed law enforcement and I wanted to go back, I was able to go back in 2014. I had to go back through another academy to get recertified. Went back into law enforcement and remained in law enforcement until I had a spinal cord and neck injury and had to retire out because of that in December 2018. But the reason I'm saying that is because I want people to know that just because you have PTSD and you receive a PTSD diagnosis does not mean you can't do your job and do whatever it is in your life that you dream about doing. And all those negative feelings and anxieties and angers and things that are plaguing you because of PTSD, once they're coped with, although you will always have PTSD, you can live your life however you want to live it. And so I really implore you to reach out and get help if you need some. Don't become a statistic. The amount of suicides in corrections and law enforcement and the military and firefighters and EMS is absolutely tragic. And that should not be your final call or your final answer.
Well, I think what you said today was very informative. I think you also reaching out to Tony, having Tony come on the show, I think we were able to give really good information out there, and it's up there for people to see it if they need it. Just a lot to take in. But the key here is being able to admit vulnerability, sharing a story that people can relate to, which opens them up to taking in the information that's provided. So again, Cody, thank you for coming on, and hopefully we have you come on again just for our regular roundtable discussions. So,
all right, thank you so much. I enjoyed it. Thank you.
As always, guys, the show is Tier Talk. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. That bell is going to notify you every time I post a video. Stay safe.